a Christian? What makes a religion Christian? Um, and we've come to the conclusion effectively that it is one question that we can ask to determine if somebody is a Christian, and that question is, who is Jesus? And if they reply with anything other than Jesus is the Son of God in a Trinitarian sense of the word, they're not Christian. We got an interesting one today. Last week we talked about Islam. I thought that was very entertaining. I really love learning about Islam, especially since I am going to Israel in May, and it's a fascinating thing to learn about. We're talking about Judaism today. Judaism, it's kind of crazy. It's especially in the context of, is it Christian? Because there are so many different facets with Judaism, which is why I wanted to talk about it specifically with you guys in the context of this question. So, in general, what is a Jew? What is Judaism? They're the Old Testament people. God's chosen. We all know and love them. They're the ones, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, everyone. Everyone in the Old Testament, Noah, Jew. Everyone in the Old Testament effectively was a Jew. If they were a mostly good guy, they were probably Jewish. Jesus. Jesus was Jewish. Matthew was Jewish. Mark was Jewish. Luke was not Jewish. John was Jewish. Luke just kind of came out of nowhere and was like, I'm going to write a gospel too. I'm not a Jew. And everyone was like, yeah, cool. And now it's one of my favorites. It's at least in the top 4 of my personal favorite gospels. The joke is that there's only 4 gospels. I digress. Here's the issue. Modern day Judaism looks very different than original Judaism. There are a lot of things that have changed. There have been extra texts that have been added. There have been extra rules. I mean, and this is stuff that even Jesus was dealing with, right? Like, there were 612 rules added. I feel like that's ever so slightly so too high, but a little bit over 600 rules that were added by the Pharisees. And Jesus was like, guys, were they added or what? I'll get my facts straight, I promise. But they had 600, I think it was 613. Whatever. Look it up. I forgot. But their focus was shifting. It wasn't a matter of following the laws because God said to. It was a matter of following the laws because it makes you look really good, which is what Jesus had an issue with the Pharisees about. And nowadays, in Judaism that I've seen, there are a lot of like TikTok creators that talk about their Jewish life and what it means to them. And there's very little talk of the Messiah. There's very little talk of any kind of a savior. And just to be clear, Messiah and Savior are synonymous. It's just different languages. Same as Christ. They all mean the same thing. But there's very little talk of that. There's little talk about what the laws mean, why they have to be followed. And that's if they follow the laws at all. Because a lot of Jewish people say you don't have to be religiously Jewish to be a Jew, which is true. It's a heritage thing too, right? Because you can track your line back to Abraham and to David. Not David necessarily, but Abraham. And but the focus has shifted away from God as a whole. So modern Judaism is what we're kind of focusing on today. So what do modern Jews think about Jesus? They don't like him. They do not like him at all. They really don't. There's, and I talked about this more in our discussion on the historicity of Jesus, but effectively, because here's the thing, no one ever said Jesus wasn't real. That is not a thing that ever came up. There was a lot of discussion on what kind of a person Jesus was. There was a lot of discussion on if Jesus was even God. There was a bunch of that, but there was no discussion on Jesus isn't real. Because he was. Spoiler alert. As a whole, they wrote the Talmud, which is they wrote that after Jesus lived and died. That lists Jesus as a billion different things. Like a heretic, a drunk, that type of thing. None of it lines up with the historic Jesus as we know him, obviously. Again, go watch the other video, it'll make more sense. Or just like read the Wikipedia article on the historicity of Jesus. I know Wikipedia is sketchy, however, it's a very good source for other sources. That's the trick. So vet your sources. Wikipedia is not as bad as people are telling you. You just have to know how to use it. So the Talmud says a bunch of that type of thing. The Mishnah Torah, which I found this date on a Jewish website, it was written over 1,000 years after Jesus lived and died. So a millennia after Jesus was gone. A millennia? Or is that a million years? No, millennia. I'm probably right. Please correct me if I'm way off base. 1,000 years after Jesus lived and died and came back, it listed a whole new set of requirements for the Messiah to fulfill. One of them is that if the Messiah is killed, he was not the Messiah. He failed, which defeats the whole point. And some of the other requirements are like, he has to rebuild the temple. He has to get all of Israel back together, which these are all things that Jesus is accomplishing. It just doesn't look like we want it to look, which is something we have to get over, really. So Jesus, not the Son of God, for sure. Really a complete heretic, not a great guy in modern Judaism views. What about the Trinitarian view? What about the Trinity in general? To Judaism, to modern Judaism, inherently heretical. There's nothing to substantiate the claim that God is anything other than one person, which I might do an entire episode on why we believe in the Trinity, because that might be interesting. Well, it is interesting, I know. It's just a matter of can I condense it. But anyway, so we don't believe in the Trinity, we don't believe in Jesus, therefore Jews are not Christians. However, here's a more interesting question. Are Christians Jews? Because like I said at the beginning, Christianity stems from Judaism. The Jews were God's chosen people. It's not like this is, like Islam, where they're just, they just grabbed Christianity and completely changed it and they're off on some other path, right? These are God's people. And if we came from Judaism, does that mean we're Jews? No. Kind of. A little bit. If you are born within the line of Abraham, great, you're a Jew. Fantastic, good job. But Gentiles can be Christian too. So Christianity, in and of itself, stemmed from Judaism. It's inherently Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. It's a thing. But you do not have to be Jewish to be a Christian. And that's stated in a billion different places in the New Testament, most notably in Romans, where Paul says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, etc., etc., etc. Another little disclaimer we have to add to this, which this is the only religion that isn't Christian, but I have to add a billion disclaimers on why. Literally, it's Judaism, and that's it. And I know the Mormons are going to be mad at me for that one. I'm sorry. Or the Latter-day Saints. I'm sorry. We're going to get to that next week. Becca's going to come on. It's going to be a great time. However, some Jews are Christian. Just like some Christians are Jews, some Jews are Christian. And some Christians aren't going to like me saying that because I'm referring to the Messianic Jews. Jews do not recognize Messianic Jews as being Jewish. And a lot of Christians do not recognize Messianic Jews as being Christian. They are. Sorry to break it to you, but they do affirm the Trinity and they do affirm that Jesus is the Messiah. Messianic Judaism is a way to both affirm that Jesus is the Messiah, he is Christ, but also maintain your Jewish roots, you know? So it's not, and a lot of Christians aren't super happy with this because the Messianic Jews often will partake in the Old Testament laws and rules and everything that we don't anymore because Jesus has fulfilled them. I don't see an issue with this. Jesus participated in them. It's not sinful. It's not. Now, it is sinful if you're doing it when, like, if I'm performing the Old Testament rituals and I'm following the Old Testament laws because I think that is going to get me into heaven, that's a different story. Works cannot get you into heaven ever. They can't. But if you're following them in order to reflect on how they predicted Jesus, not predicted, on how they foretold the coming of Jesus and how they reflect Jesus as the Messiah, how is that bad? And if you're doing it in remembrance, if I'm having a Passover dinner and I'm sitting around and I'm like, Jesus did this. This was the Last Supper, you know? That's a completely different story. So I think we should be nicer to Messianic Jews because I love the Messianic Jews. They're fantastic. And they also have more holidays than us, and I think we need more holidays because why are the two only, like, the two big ones are just Easter and Christmas? Like, why can't we have Christmas and Easter and then also Purim and Rosh Hashanah and I digress. So that's Judaism. Convoluted. As a whole, modern Judaism, not Christian. Some Jews, Christian. Some Christians, Jews. But not all Christians are Jews, and not all Jews are Christian, and it's a big mess. And that's what sin will do to you. Sin ruins everything, what can I say? So anyways, Judaism. Next week, we're talking about Latter-day Saints. We're going to have my friend Becca Prestwich on. I'm very excited. I could have an entire episode with Becca, just us talking, because 90% of our conversations are just, they could all be at the cross topics at this point. Might be a good idea. Anyways, I will see you guys next week for the Latter-day Saints.